Coming up on this week's show, play Commodore 64 games from YouTube.
An amazing new 2D Sonic game.
And we chat to video game music legend, Chris Huelsbeck.
And the Retro Hour podcast is brought to you every week with our lovely friends at Bitmap Books. Now, if you enjoy our guest Chris Huelsbeck this week, one of their books you need to check out, Commodore 64, a visual compendium, celebrating the most popular home computer of all time and exploring those legendary titles that made the C64 famous, including Drop Zone, Impossible Mission, Elite, Mercenary, Iridium, The Last Ninja, and even through to the days of stuff like Turrican, Creatures, Lemmings, Mayhem in Monsterland, that showed that there was life in the Commodore 64 well into the 90s. And this book weighs in at over 500 pages. So if you love the Commodore 64, you need to check it out. Commodore 64, a visual compendium. You can see that and the rest of their collection at bitmapbooks.com. And with our friends at PCBWay. Now, of course, you know all about PCBWay, I'm sure. If you're in the market for custom PCB prototypes with low-cost, fast turnaround quality boards, they've got you covered. And they also offer services like 3D printing and injection molding. And I'm sure you know that they're massive supporters of the retro community. In fact, have a look at their shared projects page on their website and also get an instant quote for yours right now on their website at PCBWay.com. Hello and welcome to the Retro Hour podcast, episode number 447, your weekly dose of retro gaming and technology news with me, Dan Wood.
Me, Ravi Abbott.
And me, Joe Fox.
And great to have you joining us for the podcast that every single week takes you on a nostalgic journey back to the golden age of video games. And we're not all about the past here as well, are we? We bring you up to speed on what's been happening in the amazing world of retro. Now, I was back home at my mum's house over the weekend, chatting to my brother, and he did say to me, do you not get bored of talking about like the same old things on your podcast all the time? It blew his mind that we talk about like new games that are coming out for stuff like the Amiga.
Update him on all the news and suddenly start reeling out the stories.
9 years worth of stories just there.
Well, actually,
this week, bro.
Well, he did say to me, he goes, because often when we go up there, like he'll say, can you bring your CD32 or your A500 Mini? Because obviously you grew up playing the Amiga. And I showed him Metro Siege.
Oh, yes, yeah.
We sat and played that and he couldn't believe it. He goes, what? He goes, who's making these new Amiga games then? That's all you have to listen to the podcast. We cover this kind of thing every week. And we have got another, of course, incredible section of news stories to update you on in just a moment. And of course, the main event of this podcast, the second half, when we welcome on an industry legend to tell us their story. And I think it's fair to say we got pretty good value out of attending Retromessa in Norway last month, didn't we, Ravi, in terms of guests?
Well, they had such an amazing selection of guests, to be honest. Like, it was their 10th anniversary, and my God, some of the guests there are just top level, especially the music guests as well. You know, we had Yoko Shimomura on the podcast previously. Well, Yoko actually did a concert with this week's guest, and it is Chris Huelsbeck. And Chris is an absolute legend. Like, you know, so many systems and so many sounds Chris has done, and he's actually creating stuff at the moment. I'd say he's prolific at the amount of tunes that he releases, remix albums, and even vinyl.
Yeah, and obviously we know Chris very well for his work on the Commodore 64, I think, in terms of, you know, the retro crowd. That's where he's most famous, isn't he? Stuff like Turrican.
Oh, yeah, Great Giana as well, which is always interesting to talk about.
You and I are always going to have the debate. Great Giana Sisters, I say. You're always going to say Giana. You say Giana, I say Giana.
All the time. Yeah.
And of course, R-Type as well on the Commodore 64, an incredible soundtrack he did on that too. And the thing that impressed me a lot about talking to Chris is we've actually had him on the podcast before, but it was all the way back in 2016.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we only did like a 20-minute chat with him then. You know, that was the early days of the podcast when we're still kind of finding our feet. But this one goes really in depth, doesn't it?
Well, Chris has been, you know, constantly doing stuff. Like, I always turn up at these events. He's got these beautiful vinyl releases, and it's often in another country as well. So I'm like, I can't fit this on the plane, but I really want it. And, you know, he's also been doing some amazing soundtracks for just absolutely awesome titles that have been coming out as well. Interstellar Sentinel, we talk about, and Tiny 4 as well, which if you haven't checked out, they're in a retro style, but my God, they're beautiful, beautiful artwork as well. And Chris's music really matches with that. And we kind of talk about Chris's history, but also, you know, his modern approach to creating titles and how things have changed from the days of C64 limitation with music and how he expands out from that using, you know, modern systems and what setup he's using and how he still creates these sounds.
Even going back to roots as well, because recently he's been working with the Mega Drive, hasn't he? Making Mega Drive music.
Yeah.
So, which is really interesting, kind of how he's approaching that in 2024, and also going back to stuff like, you know, the TF-MX music format and how he made those legendary Commodore 64 soundtracks back in the day and winning.
And, you know, getting his old equipment out as well and trying to get that working again.
And of course, the live concerts now that celebrate his music, you know, stuff like the Symphonic Shades concert as well, which are just amazing. If you haven't seen one of those before, definitely worth checking those out on YouTube. And also, of course, I mean, the thing is, when we're at Retromessa, obviously we do these events all around the world. The amount of people that were lining up after the panel with like vinyl copies of his soundtracks to get him to sign them, it was just, you know, the amount of autographs he had to sign. He was like a rock star, wasn't he?
These guys are like rock stars to us, you know. This kind of video game, it seems like a bit of a niche, doesn't it? You know, video game music, but then, you know, you play some of the tunes and people will be like, yes, I know that straight away. And, you know, these really stand out and they kind of defined our youth as well. So having Chris on is just amazing, and it was great to talk to him in person.
Yeah, great to catch up with him as well. Such a lovely guy. So our special guest, Chris Huelsbeck, for a bit of a catch-up, you know, 8 years after we originally had him on the podcast, and find out what he's been up to since and expand a bit more on those early stories. And we've got a few crowd questions in there too. So our final panel from Retromessa in Norway, the legend that is Chris Huelsbeck, he's on the show in around half an hour from now. But that does mean we have got about 30 minutes or so to rattle through this week's news stories, because it has been another busy week in retro. And it does seem like the 2D Sonic scene, the fan games, are really alive right now. We're always talking about these kind of Sonic game jams. And this one that's been on recently, the Sonic Amateur Games Expo, has given us one game that everyone has been going insane for recently. This looks like it could be one of the best fan-made 2D Sonic games we've ever seen. And really, it looks like something that we wish we had on the Sega Saturn back in the day.
This looks absolutely fantastic. And the Sage, or the Sonic Amateur Games Expo this year, has given us many, many, many fantastic Sonic games, which we've spoke about in detail on previous episodes. But this one, Sonic Ultra Saturn, looks insane. Like the attention to detail of kind of like the lore of like those early Sonic games. And I love kind of like the pun of it, because obviously we never got an official mainline Sonic Sega Saturn game, and this looks like it would be very much at home on the Sega Saturn, as well as this game being set on Saturn's moon as well, if you read the story of the game as well, which is quite interesting. So a little
with the Sega Saturn S for the S of Saturn.
Yeah. This game looks absolutely fantastic. Very much borrows a lot from Sonic 3 and Sonic and Knuckles in terms of sprite work, level design, etc. But I think if if you went to somebody like your brother, for example, because you mentioned him earlier on, and told him, oh, this was the Sega Saturn version of Sonic the Hedgehog that came out, and just showed him this, I don't think he would question it.
No.
You know, if somebody who wasn't aware, like knows who Sonic is, but didn't know, you know, and is into gaming, but didn't know there wasn't a Sonic game on the Sega Saturn, or kind of like what Sonic games are out there, I think they would believe you if they saw this as an official release.
And I think this is what the Saturn was kind of built for. You know, these like 2D, but with amazing effects. And
yes,
you know, a lot of developers struggled with the 3D, but this really makes it shine. And something I would have loved to have actually seen if they'd fully, you know, embraced that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Area, you know. Yeah,
and as well as very classic looking Sonic levels, Madness Mountain, Dynamite Plant, Crystal Frost, Rainy Savannah, which all sound like, you know, classic Sonic levels. What is really cool is these 3D levels where they're kind of like, you know, with like the sprite scaling and stuff from behind, very similar to kind of like F-Zero kind of looking graphics, you know, with that Mode 6 from the Super Nintendo.
Yes.
Where you're on the back of Tails' plane, but from a behind point of view. chasing after Dr. Robotnik's kind of giant green flying machine that's in Sonic
some of the
3.
boss levels look absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
And, it's sort of got that kind of Space Harrier
yes,
angle
there we go.
going on.
That's a better point of reference there. Yeah, very much like Space Harrier. And obviously a lot of work has gone into that because a lot of the sprite work and stuff has obviously been borrowed from other games, but a lot of this is original, pixel art and sprite work as well. It just looks absolutely fantastic. I think it's been made by an unsonic Ryu, but it is only on PC. I think they're missing a trick by not porting it to the Sega Saturn. But
I was going to break that gently, Joe, because that is the one question that everybody is asking in all the comments, on the tweets, on the YouTube video. Like, so does this play on the Sega Saturn? And the answer unfortunately is no. And then they're like, oh that's a shame.
which is a real shame. Have you guys watched the very 90s trailer he's made for it as well?
It looks very homemade.
It's very homemade, but it's very akin to the Sega Saturn adverts and the late Mega Drive adverts, which I think is really funny. He makes a video about how the disc for Sonic Ultra Saturn can be used as like a tool around the house for like anything because it's so robust and stuff. I think it's in Spanish, maybe. I'm not 100% sure what the language is there, but this game looks absolutely fantastic. If you go on the actual stage page, it gives you a lot more information about the game, even down to the bonus stages. Look like Sonic 3D, but it's kind of like a snooker game where you're a ball and you've got to pot other balls, and you're hitting Sonic with a pool cue kind of thing. I think very, very, very original and inventive with what he's done here. I really want to play this. This looks absolutely fantastic.
And there's even some CD disc art as well, isn't there, that you can print out that looks like a Sega Saturn game, a Japanese release. I think, it looks amazing. I'm just thinking it's a free download. At the time of recording, over 2,000 people have downloaded this. Plays on modern PCs and Windows. I'm wondering, though, is the next step someone going to port this to the Sega Saturn? I've got a feeling that feels like someone should attempt that. I feel
like it'll be ported to the Dreamcast.
Yeah, probably.
First, because like I say, I'm not very good with this kind of stuff. But just with everybody always do this, the Dreamcast scene seems a lot more prevalent with the homebrew scene. So I could see that happening first, but I could imagine somebody getting this running on the Sega Saturn.
It's picking up on the Saturn. We're seeing lots of proof of concepts and stuff like that.
True.
Who knows?
A lot of PS1 games are getting ported to the Saturn at the moment as proof of concepts and stuff. So you are right there, Ravi. So we'll see.
Either that or someone will finish Sonic Extreme at some point. I've got a feeling there's going to be a big Sonic game that we're going to all love on the Saturn at some point. I feel like it's maybe in 2025. That's my prediction. Someone make it happen, please, so don't look stupid. So if you want to download that now, it is free, and I'll link that up in this week's show notes. Now, obviously, in 2024, we've got many ways to get games onto our classic systems. I mean, I'm looking over at my consoles next to me. Pretty much all of them got flash carts in there with SD cards in the top of them. If you've got Commodore 64 even, you can get SD2 ICs and 1541 Ultimates. It's dead easy these days, even Wi-Fi cards and stuff like that. Yeah. But maybe you want something a little bit more esoteric. What about playing and downloading Commodore 64 games from YouTube?
Okay, this is bonkers. I've tried to get my head around it. I think I've worked it out, but this is kind of like a thing that you'd explain to a kid, them not having any concept of how these kind of old computers work. Their mind would just be gone.
So like me.
It would take weeks.
Explain it to Joe, Ravi. There you go. There's your approach to this.
This is my explanation. C64s usually receive data through cassettes. So, the binary data was sent through audio, and it would extract the audio. This is going to be a really bad explanation.
I'm following you so far.
It would basically receive the audio, and then that would turn into code that would be created for a game. This is doing it through YouTube. So they're basically using photon resistors, which are little resistors, which are, I think they're reacting to the video. And within the video, they've done some little dots that are basically sending data to the C64 via
They
YouTube.
flash off and on, so it's basically binary off and on.
Off and on, yeah. So ones
Right.
and zeros. And that is sending this small amount of information that you need for the games to the C64, but through a YouTube video. Now, the problem with this YouTube video is when you upload something to YouTube, YouTube compresses it and changes the video. So, it won't play like it's original. So this guy, Rod Hull from the...
Not that one.
Oh, no, sorry.
Yeah, not Emu.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Bad
Different
joke. Rod Hull from The Future Was 8-Bit, which is absolutely great site. And Dave Curran as well from Tynemouth Software have come up with this way of streaming called Jelly Load, which is really mad, actually, receiving the data. Because we've heard about data being received through radio as well. And I've always kind of assumed, it's an audio thing. Receiving data that way. We've seen games being loaded from data received on vinyl as well, but seeing it received on a video file is something totally different, and streaming video at that.
And to be fair, having it audio format would probably make more sense, because I guess you could have, like maybe a skippable section of a YouTube video that played the game audio. And you could
Imagine if you're
that
doing
way.
it and an advert pops up halfway.
Yeah, in the middle and ruins your download, yeah, which probably would happen on YouTube, to be fair. But there was actually a TV series back in the 80s called, I think it was called For Computer Buffs. And they basically did it this way on television. So you could record games for the Commodore 64, the Spectrum or the BBC Micro. So it's kind of based on that similar experiment that the BBC did.
Yeah. I love the ingenuity of it, and how, that is true hacking to me, and playing around using this really modern piece of technology, streaming video and using it to send a C64 game. I think that's just, and there's kind of like a nice element of, it's like a kind of spy thing, you know what I mean? It's like a secret little code that only people have and can decipher. I'd love to see, if they did Bandersnatch or something like that, Bandersnatch 2 on Netflix, and they had like hidden games in there and stuff. That would be
awesome.
Awesome. Or in a video game movie,
Yeah, or even like someone like LGR just kind of, putting that in the corner of one of his videos and not saying what it is.
Yeah, it's going to start happening now, isn't it? Yeah. Now they've cracked the YouTube code, yeah.
There were some requirements when they made this. Obviously, you mentioned about the YouTube algorithm and the compression and all that kind of thing. They said that, first of all, this process has to be quick enough to fit into a normal video, so like 5 to 10 minutes, the average kind of YouTube length.
Yeah.
And it must be receivable by a Commodore VIC-20 using a simple hardware interface that would have been available at the time. So the hardware used for this is basically 80s level technology. It's nothing that wouldn't have existed back then. They're saying it is pretty slow. It's only sending 30 bits a second. So they reckon it's roughly on par with using a 300 baud modem.
I always wondered if there was something going on. When you used to watch CRT TV, so this is me going off on a tangent, but in the corner there'd be like a little flashing black and white thing. I'm sure our listeners will know what it was. And I'm sure that was something to do with infrared or...
I thought it was to do with when the adverts were about to come on.
Yeah, that is it.
Oh.
I was trying to find codes that weren't there.
Yeah, it's basically, I think back in the day when they actually had people in the, like vision mixers, physical people, like when there was live broadcast going on, they'd put those little, they're kind of like little rectangles, weren't they, with black and white diagonal scrolling lines. So basically saying adverts coming up, so it would give the people in the control room time to get the adverts when you show like a countdown. Yeah. So there you go, yeah. They have got a name like Q boxes or something like that. You still see them occasionally, I think, only on like live events now. You might see them like during football and that kind of thing. But yeah, so unfortunately they weren't sending any hidden signals, Ravi.
No, that's
you can't download them on your Spectrum or anything. But yeah, very interesting experiment, and it's always nice to see novel ways of getting software onto your retro systems. So if you want to check out that video and the article as well, I'll link that in this week's show notes. Now, I thought this was an interesting story, and it wasn't a story I was familiar with before, but I've done some reading on this, and it sounds like quite an interesting tale. This is a game called Rule of Rose. There's apparently a very rare PlayStation 2 game that now looks like it could be becoming much more readily available. Now, I thought it might be interesting to kind of go into the story of what happened with this game. I mean, were you familiar with this story before, Joe?
I sort of know the story of this. So Rule of Rose is I want to say a horror game for PS2.
Survival horror kind of thing.
Survival horror game, late release, 2006. And just to kind of set up the story a little bit, regularly sells for around £600, £500 to £600 on eBay, high £500 end in CEX in the UK. My understanding is it came out as normal in Japan and America, and obviously it's a late release for the PS2. Late release games on consoles tend to become quite rare anyway, because a lot of people might have moved on to the next gen. They don't get as many, sales or as many games printed, etc. But from what I understand, this game was pulled soon after release in the UK because there was a fake news story in Italy about how you could murder a little girl in the game, I believe.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean,
right.
Time Extension have done basically a breakdown of this story. That link up is just really interesting read, quite a long article, but yeah, it kind of goes into all that. And it was an Italian weekly magazine called Panorama, nothing to do with the British TV show, who said that, basically it said the aim of this game was to, whoever buries the little girl alive wins the game.
Right.
So they wrote this article basically condemning the game, also saying that it had erotic content in there and violent scenes containing underage people, saying that the game was perverse and everything and sadistic.
Right.
But it turned out that they just basically invented the whole thing.
I would have played it. They would just make a controversial thing about this game.
Well, I mean, Sony were distributing it and it spooked them.
Right.
So they were basically like you said, they thought that if that headline's out there, they want to be a family-friendly company. They didn't want that to be a scandalous release. Mm-hmm. So they declared they're not going to be distributing that game in the USA at E3 in 2006 because it was not compatible with their image.
Right.
And it turns out that apparently there's a bit of I've been looking through some Reddit threads, bit of a dispute on whether or not the game came out in the UK.
Yeah.
Some people say that there were PAL versions of it, but they weren't English language. But apparently they've all got English language modes in the game, but not the manuals in the box.
Yeah.
And then someone else said they've actually got a copy of it. So
it seems to be a bit of a confusing one because I'm in the CEX Retro Watch on Facebook, which is, people just posting when games are available or when they've returned said games, etc. A lot of CEX workers in there as well, kind of, saying when nice condition rare games have come in and stuff like that. And I see this one pop up pretty much daily. There's a copy of Rule of Rose in this CEX. Does anybody know the condition of it? And often people will go, oh, it's the Portuguese version. I went in and checked it. It's the French version. And then every now and then somebody will pop up and go, well, I've got the UK version of it. And then people will be like, well, show us the manual, show us what language the manual's in, etc., kind of thing. So I don't actually know because I've just not paid enough attention to it, whether the UK release ever did hit the shelves or not. But the reason we're talking about this is obviously it's a very expensive PlayStation 2 game. It's up there probably in the top 5 or 10 pricey PS2 games. But what's happened is the game is actually plummeting on eBay down to around the £200 mark because of, strangely, in Italy, I'm not too sure how this has happened, but an eBay seller has, I believe, found a shipping container full of sealed versions of this game, which I imagine are the versions that never got shipped to the UK, maybe. And
ones that were destined for retail by the looks of it.
Yeah, and they've listed them on eBay for approximately £230.
They had
euros.
Over 300 of them.
Yeah.
454 have sold at the time of recording.
Wow.
And they're still available.
So it's obviously just flooded the market. Which is interesting because about 10 years ago, this happened with the Virtual Boy in America. Somebody found a shipping container of sealed Virtual Boys.
There was that
flooded the market with them.
Petro Chischenko, the old head of Amiga, found loads of Amiga Magic Packs in a warehouse
in India. Wasn't
in
it?
India, I think. Yeah.
Oh wow!
He was selling them, and that kind of reduced the price a little bit at the time. It's interesting to see the effects of this, but also how many stashes are out there of these really kind of rare things, and is someone just going to pop up? Like, obviously, if this seller was really in it for the long-term game, they would have eked them out slowly, but it seems like with that many, they've just like get rid and then crash the market.
It's interesting that you should say that, because like you say, they've just got rid of them and crashed them. I mean, I guess from their point of view, they've sold 400 odd games at 230 quid, so
exactly.
massively quids in, tens of thousands of pounds in one chunk. But then I also heard the story, I forget the exact name of the game, but there's a few Smurfs, the little blue guys, games for the Mega Drive, and there was one that supposedly never came out, and once again a shipping container was found of them of quite a few years ago in, I want to say, in Amsterdam, in Holland. And the guy who has them, he apparently only puts like one up a month on eBay and sells it for like a couple of €100, but he's just consistently done that for years, just putting one up every month.
That's his wage.
It's probably just like a nice little side hustle for them. So they're playing the long game with it, like you say, rather than flooding the market. Like, they could have played the long game with this and just sold one every month for like €500 maybe.
Yeah, and they were sealed as well.
Yeah.
So,
but they made 120,000 euros in like a month.
Yeah.
Oh, you've done the maths. Yeah. There we go. Wow.
Yeah, I had to be working it out. So not a bad month's trading, that is it. And looking at it, I mean, it's got the Union Jack flag on there. It's English language box. So it looks like it is the ones that were intended for the UK, or at least a portion of them that they've probably discovered in some dusty warehouse somewhere.
And to be fair, selling them off and getting the market, you made it cheaper for everyone. So and more available for people as well. So
and they might find another box. You never know; it might not be the only one. There's 8 left at the time of recording this podcast. So who knows? Maybe there'll be, there could have been an entire warehouse of these things.
Interesting story. I always kind of love these things when they crop up, just like oddities like that.
It makes me think as well how unfairly that game was destroyed. I mean, I think in today's climate, that would be a lawsuit, wouldn't it, if a magazine
destroy their reputation, But I can imagine there's a warehouse full of Nintendo PlayStation somewhere.
You reckon?
I'm
it does make you wonder. It makes you wonder what else is out there. But also you need to have the right person finding them. Because, some random person just opened that might be like, oh, PlayStation 2, they only go for about £2-3. PS2 games are not worth anything.
Given to a charity shop.
Yeah, they might not realise what it was. So,
which would be good for charity as well. So,
we need to get Joe on like Storage Wars or something. And just,
that would be brilliant.
Find a stash. So if you want one of those, there are 8 available at the time of recording this podcast. I'll link up the eBay auction. Ooh. Now, this is quite exciting. A good friend of the podcast that we had on several years ago, and of course here in the UK, we all know him from presenting The Gadget Show, which if you haven't seen that before, it's basically a bit like Top Gear for geeks, isn't it?
Yeah, I love The Gadget Show. It's been on for years. And it's interesting because there's not that many mainstream, technology shows on the TV. And they also did on The Gadget Show, little bits about retro gaming as well. They, each host has their own personality and their own kind of interests. And Jason's always been the kind of retro guy. I know he's been to video gaming events. He does breakdancing, and he's like full 80s boy, isn't he? He's
got DeLorean in that, isn't he? I think.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. So he's into filmmaking, and
this is Jason Bradbury we're talking about.
Yeah, Jason Bradbury, and he's really into filmmaking, and you can see that from when he does his streams on Twitch as well, because his camera is just like insane, and he's got all the lighting all set up. You can tell he's like trained in it as well. But he's doing a Kickstarter at the moment, which is a really interesting concept, actually.
Yeah, well, like you said, he's always wanted to be a filmmaker. He said we know him as being a television presenter here in the UK. We had him on the podcast probably about 4 or 5 years ago, didn't we?
Yeah.
Talking about The Gadget Show and his love for retro. But he's going to be doing an indie movie, basically, which he's describing as The In-Betweeners meets War Games, which for me ticks a lot of boxes, being fans of both The In-Betweeners and War Games being my favourite movie of all time. But it's got a good story, hasn't it? It's basically a group of retro gamers who are tasked with taking down a rogue artificial intelligence.
I think And they all meet at a retro gaming expo, and they kind of come from that, armed with nothing but vintage games consoles and floppy disks and old computers.
I'm wondering, do you think he's going to be filming at Play Expo next month?
I don't know. I was just looking at this and I was thinking, this would be none of us. It would be people that are much cooler that have ended up at the expo by accident. Because I'd get trapped in an escape room for 2 days, because I'm hopeless at these kind of things. But I do love like a hacking film, or, using old technology and kind of to defeat, big enemies, or taking something down with something simple. Like, of course, it's totally rubbish, but in the Independence Day film, when they, fire the virus into the aliens.
Or the alien ship just happened to be running Windows 95. That was a stroke of luck.
And it's like, oh no, or like Enemy of the State or something. I love those old kind of hackers defeat the great enemy. And this looks like a story of that, but, this time they've got Sinclair C5s and floppy disks.
What do you think of this, Joe? This looks quite Beale Street.
Yeah, I mean, you're going to kill me now here. I've never seen War Games.
Get out.
I know. But interestingly, everything Ravi's just said, Independence Day, Enemy of the State,
I just named Will Smith movies.
Yeah, I did wonder. They are films I've seen many, many times and do enjoy, even though they are silly. And I do enjoy the in-betweeners, as many people in British culture do. So I'm looking forward to this. I think it's going to be cool. I'm looking forward to see what the Kickstarter brings and what how much it's going to be and what you get for backing it, etc. Because I imagine it will come out for everybody to see. So it does say it's going to have like cool merch, and you can even be in the film and stuff like that. I guess you can pay to be an extra in there. From backing it, and I'm guessing producer credits and stuff like that, or you can just get your name on the arcade credits in the film and stuff like that.
Well,
which looks pretty cool.
I also think they've got like Mark Felgate involved. They've got Elizabeth Blake Thomas and Utah Saints are doing the soundtrack. So that's absolutely banging. We've had Utah Saints on the podcast. They also did a Final Vendetta soundtrack. They've got a bit of a retro gaming connection there, and I think this is interesting. I love Bandersnatch because it was a drama story based around the video games world. It wasn't a strict documentary or anything like that, and I kind of like the idea of having some entertainment with it as well.
I love the idea as well that basically AI is going to go completely rogue and you can't use modern technology.
We all know it's going to go rogue, Dan. We've been predicting it for years.
And the idea of this film is that, those of us who are hoarding like, Amigas and old PCs, eventually we're going to have a reason for having these systems. We're going to save the world.
Save the world in the end.
Yeah.
That's
one Amiga.
We're going to be the unlikely heroes. Yeah, there you go. That outsmart the AI. So it does look a load of fun. So if you want to check that out, that is going to be launching on Kickstarter. Hopefully by the time this podcast comes out. So I'll link that in the show notes as well. And it's one more story before we hop into our chat with Chris Huelsbeck, live from Retromessa in Norway. And appropriately, this is a Commodore 64 story because a brilliant platformer from, God, must be going back, 10, 15 years, I think this game first came out. Originally, I played this on the PS3, and I've got it on Xbox Game Pass as well. But this is Spelunky, which is now getting a official port, and it's available for the Commodore 64. Have you guys played Spelunky before?
I haven't, and I've been recommended it many, many times. But I really struggle with these. We were talking about it earlier on before we started recording. These, inverted commas, rogue-like games. So this is a platformer, isn't it? But when the game, every time you play it, it generates it differently. The level, is a different...
Randomly
generated.
That's
it, procedure generation. I really struggle with those kind of games because I don't get a sense of progression from them, or a sense of like, if I keep dying or if I turn the game off and try it again, it's different. Like, I like to know this is the set path of the game. This is like in Fallout, like a lot of people ask me, do you like Borderlands? And I'm like, well, no, because I don't. Borderlands is a bit different because it's based around like loot. But, I like to know if you go to this place, you'll get this weapon, for example. And Spelunky is like that. It's procedurally generated. But I am very impressed to see that not only is it on the C64, but it features that in the C64, which is a little bit mind-blowing for me.
Yeah, the levels are all randomly generated, even on the Commodore 64. If you haven't played it before, like you said, it's a platformer. You've got basically a booby-trapped cave system.
Yeah.
Snakes and bats. You've got to collect treasure, rescue other characters as well, escape levels, move on to the next one as well. It's quite a cutesy kind of game when you play it on the platform.
It's like a cut-down version for the C64 as well, because it was originally came out for the PC, and then it was on the 360 arcade.
It's on the Vita as well, I think, isn't it? I'm sure it's on the
PlayStation and modern systems. So, it's quite well done, the way that they've reduced the game down, but, kept these unique features of it, and obviously fit the graphics palette and the whole window impressively on the C64 as well. It looks like quite detailed for the C64, and nice little music as well. And I think... There you go. I think if you have the core elements of a game like this and you still keep them whilst you're reducing it, it's fantastic.
I love as well that it's not. First, when I saw this, I thought it's going to be like an unofficial kind of fan port, but it's not.
No.
It's actually
done by the original dev.
Yeah, the original developer, Mossmouth, Derek Yu. He's give his backing to this as well. This is a guy called Paul Collar who's currently working on this with a musician called Mikkel Hastrup, who are both working on this game at the moment. So, I think looks really, really good. And you can actually get this right now from their itch.io page for just $2.99. And can be played on original Commodore 64s or an emulator of your choice. So I think it's awesome to see, like, I would do this in quotes, but a modern game, even though it originally came out back in 2008, modern by our standards, getting backported to the Commodore 64. And again, that actually plays really well on it by the looks of it. So if you want to get hold of that, that is available right now. Right then, patrons, hold tight. We have got a couple of extra news stories just for you, talking about an amazing new point-and-click adventure game, and also the console that Japan have selected for its Future Technology Heritage Registry, interestingly. So more on that for our patrons, because we do that every week on the podcast. We give our patrons a couple of extra news stories because we chop all the adverts out for the patrons, so, you don't get a shorter show. And if you'd like to support us on Patreon, we do have an hangout that we do every month as well, that will be coming up very soon as well. We normally do that last Sunday of the month, so that will be next week. Sunday, 29th of September. Hangouts are always a giggle, aren't they? For people who haven't joined them before, it's definitely worth coming on.
They're awesome fun, getting everybody together, and people are sharing all of their setups, and we all see some amazing stuff in there. There's some gaming rooms, people take us on tours. We talk about the most random thing. It can go off topic very quickly, and
usually does.
Yeah, that's always good. It's usually about like retro culture, and it's a really nice group that we've had on there. We started that years ago, and it's just kept going, and it's like it's quite a relief actually. You just sit there, enjoy it on a Sunday. It's really nice. But also we've got the After Hours podcast, and the thing that I love about the After Hours is you can sign up to it on your phone. So you can add in the RSS feed on like any of your podcast clients on your phone, and you get the whole backlog of episodes. And I don't know how long it would take you to listen to it, but probably over a week or two, because there's so many episodes.
45 episodes now.
45 episodes to consume.
Some of them are 2 hours long.
Yeah, so that is a huge backlog. So if you sign up, you'll get all of those extra episodes, and we're discussing all sorts in there, and there's some really funny stuff in there.
Well, for the latest one as well, Dan said that we don't do anything for our patrons. My God. We subjected ourselves to playing some of the worst video games of all time.
Yeah, that went down well. I actually got some Aquaman fans saying, right, we're going to play it, and we're going to start a fan club.
So if you'd like to join our wonderful patrons community, and of course, make sure that we can just keep the lights on and keep bringing out podcasts all the way into 2025. Really appreciate your support, just for the price of a cup of coffee once a month. All the details to support the podcast and join our wonderful community are on the website at theretrohour.com. Right then, before we hop into our special guest, Chris Huelsbeck, recorded live at Retromessa in Norway, let's take a second to give a big thank you to this week's sponsor, and that is our friends at ExpressVPN. Now, obviously, we're getting into autumn now. It was quite nice to record the podcast at like 8 p.m. tonight and look outside and it'd be dark. Definitely feels, we like this time of year, especially you and I, don't we, Joe? When it gets a bit spooky and Halloween's coming up and Christmas.
Yeah, boy.
Only thing is about this time of year, it gets a bit expensive, doesn't it? Obviously, Christmas is coming up soon.
You're staying in a lot more as well with that weather.
Yeah, that's it. There's heating bills. So you want to get value for money. And I actually heard something mind-blowing recently. That apparently Netflix have got more than 18,000 titles around the world on their systems. But only something like 6,000 of them are available on the UK Netflix. So get that, you're literally missing out on thousands of great shows. But there is a way around that, isn't there? That's by using our sponsor, ExpressVPN. How does this work, Ravi? Because I know you do this regularly.
Yeah, so basically you switch countries and virtually, yes, and you do it in the comfort of your own home. You don't have to catch a plane or anything, and it's really great with ExpressVPN. It's just a one click, and you can go straight to a totally different country and get the content that's available on that geolocation and have it delivered to your device very fast as well. ExpressVPN, I don't even notice when it's on. And you can have it on your smart TV, you can have it on your phone, you can have it on your computer. It's really fantastic, and it enables you to watch stuff that's not available. Like I've been watching. I'm going to do the music. That's awful. Yeah,
I'll be back.
Terminator 2. Yeah, on the Australian Netflix.
Well, there is that new Terminator series, isn't there? So Terminator Zero that everyone's been raving about recently on Netflix. So if you want to watch the movies as well, like you said.
Yeah.
Terminator 2 available on Australian Netflix via ExpressVPN.
Yeah, and The Godfather on a Canadian.
Classic.
And Joker as well, which is an awesome movie. Pretty dark Joker is on the South Korean one.
Yeah, so using ExpressVPN, like you said, it's speeding fast as well. No buffering, nothing like that. No, stream it straight to your devices. And they've actually got servers in over 100 countries. So you can get access to thousands of new shows, never run out of stuff to watch. Doesn't just work with Netflix, works with Disney Plus, BBC iPlayer, Hulu, even YouTube as well, which, does have region lock content on there. Dead easy to use. Fire up the app, click one button, change locations, works on all your devices too. And it's also rated number one by top tech sites like CNET and The Verge and PC Pro magazine as well. And we'd love you to try it out for yourself. So be smart and stop paying full price for these streaming services and only getting access to a fraction of their content. You can get your money's worth. ExpressVPN pays for itself. And you can use our exclusive link so they know that we sent you, expressvpn.com/retro. Use that and you will get 3 months of ExpressVPN for free on top of a 1-year plan. So that's expressvpn.com/retro. I'll put that in this week's show notes. And a massive thank you to our friends at ExpressVPN for their continued support. Right then, well, thank you for checking out the news. This week, we'll have more for you on next Friday's podcast. And next, recorded live at Retromessa in Norway, bringing you an absolute legend, Chris Huelsbeck, is coming up on the Retro Hour podcast. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Retromessa, day number 2. My name's Dan Wood, and I host a podcast with Ravi, who's over there, called the Retro Hour Podcast. And the aim of our show is to record stories from people who worked on the games that we played when we were growing up. And that's exactly what we're doing today here on stage at Retromessa, interviewing some absolute legends, including someone now who soundtracked many of our favourite games growing up, a true icon in the world of video game music. Please give a very warm welcome to Mr. Chris Huelsbeck.
Thank you.
Now, we are going to give you a chance to ask some questions in a while. I'm going to ask Chris a few as well, but first you've got a little presentation you'd like to play for us, Chris.
Yeah, just in case somebody here doesn't know my history, I was born in Kassel, Germany, 1968, and I developed an interest in music at a very young age. My family, they were all heavy into music. My grandma, mom, and aunt, they were all piano teachers. And they tried to teach me classical piano at 5 years old. but I wasn't that interested in it because, well, first off, my grandma was kind of old school, and when we would make mistakes, she would hit our fingers with a stick. So I didn't like that. Anyway, I stuck with it about 2 years, but I'm not like a sight reader for notes or whatever, but I got the basics there for like playing keyboards, piano. Yeah, I got like interested in synthesizers. And so that first piece on the radio, Popcorn from Gershon Kingsley. So that was like something that sounded totally interesting and new to me. And then, of course, like the beginning of the 80s was just an explosion of synthesizer music. And I wanted to own a synthesizer, but the family could not afford it. It was just too expensive. So I got an electronic organ and played around with that for a little bit. Here's one of my first recordings that I ever did as an 11-year-old. And this was before MIDI, so that was actually live playing into a cassette tape recorder. And then I was also interested in electronics, and I took everything apart and rarely got it back together again. But I actually did circuit bending before that was even a thing, you know. So I opened up the organ and I made new connections and I played around with the different things and I got some interesting new sounds out of it that sounded a little bit like a synthesizer. So here's another piece that was maybe like a year later. So I was already pretty happy with that, and then I took it a little bit too far, and eventually the organ blew up. So that was that. So then I read in an ad that the Commodore 64, I was also interested in computers, of course, had a real synthesizer sound chip. And that's when I really thought like, okay, this could be my entrance in owning a synthesizer. So I saved up money and, you know, delivering newspapers and stuff like that to be able to buy a C64. And first year I was only playing games with it. And then eventually I became interested in programming. I wanted to actually make my own games, but I wasn't as good making games. But a friend of mine, he was really good developing games and he already sold one to a company. He was working on a second one and he needed music for his game. So I used my new programming skills in assembly code and made the first music on the C64 for his game. There's always a little bit of buffering here from the internet, but okay, so that was the first piece, and then he was super happy about it. I kept developing my assembly language and making a better sound driver, and I read about a contest in a magazine about music with the C64, and I sent a piece in and I hope to get just in the top 10 of the contestants, so I could get on the cover disc of that magazine. And to my surprise, I won the contest, and that was the piece that really started my career, and much more advanced than this one, called Shades. So you can already hear like this was maybe half a year between the two pieces, how much it improved because I got better with the programming. I had new ideas, and then I also built this hardware keyboard that was attached to the C64. That was before MIDI and everything. So pretty crazy stuff there. And then I finally went from hacking the music data into the memory as hexadecimal numbers. I made an editor called the Sound Monitor, which was still used some hex numbers, but you could type in the notes with like note names and stuff. And this is considered by many like the grandfather of trackers. And then I also did like, I pushed the envelope with sampling playback on the C64 and more voices and all that. So here's one of those examples. So yeah, always trying to come up with something better and new. And then finally, when I got into games, the samples, that was a phase, and then it got to CPU and memory intensive for the games, and I developed another system called TFMX. The new thing about that one was you could actually run a little program for each note played, and that's something that I haven't seen to this day on anything. And I did it on the Amiga then, and later on the Nintendo 64 and other things. And this was the last piece. Yeah, and that sound language that I developed helped to make the sound so full, and doesn't even use any samples there, but it sounds like a lot of voices are playing at the same time. So then came TFMX Amiga, which used the same concept. And this was sample based, of course. And I did another R-Type title that was more cinematic. And again, in pushing the envelope, a friend of mine had a really kick-ass player on the Atari ST, which could emulate the Amiga playback. So it would mix four voices with the CPU because the Atari ST didn't have that sound chip that the Amiga had. And he mixed it on the CPU and very efficiently. And I asked him if I could see his source code, and we ported it back to the Amiga and ran that on one of the Amiga voices. So that became then 3 normal Amiga voices, and the 4 CPU voices together were the 7 voice system. And that became probably my most famous piece from Turrican 2. Yeah. Yeah, and then in the early 90s, my dream came true. I owned a bunch of real synthesizers, and I built a studio, and put out my first CD, which in 91 was pretty unheard of like a game musician putting out a CD, and it sold really well. And so had fun with that. I did more CDs in the following years. I'm now at 55 albums on my Bandcamp and other outlets. Yeah, this was one of the things I always made sure I at least ask for it, that I can put out the music on an album. I try to not sell all the rights to my music to the games company, but exclude the soundtracks. Then I moved to the US in '98, and I developed the music system together with Factor 5, where we used it to make music for Star Wars Rogue Squadron on the Nintendo 64 and GameCube and those kind of systems. That actually became a Nintendo official third-party tool. Then in 2008, I had my first symphony concert, which a friend and fan of mine organized, and that was Symphonic Shades. Here's an example. So that was the first video game concert with a live orchestra outside of Japan. Then in 2010, I got a Lifetime Achievement Award, which I was proud of and at the same time scared, because isn't that something you get at the end of your career? Anyway, so then I did more orchestra recordings for other projects. And then in 2012, I did a Kickstarter for the Turrican Complete Anthology. So all the pieces I redid in the studio and put them out on CD. And this was actually at the time the most successful Kickstarter for video game music. Then in 2015 we did Piano Collection. And here's another art type, piano this time. So that wasn't me playing. I wish I could play like that. This was actually a fan of mine that I collaborated with. His name is Patrick Nevian, and yeah, he does amazing renditions of video game music. And then, in 2016 and 2017, we did more orchestral recordings of Turrican music and put out dedicated albums, again funded by Kickstarter fans. And the second one here is orchestral selections. I have an example here of video from the recording session of Air Combat, which is one of my favorite pieces from that. And you wouldn't believe it, but that sound is actually from the phone that recorded that in the live session. So the album actually sounds even better when we mixed it. But this was really remarkable. So, and then in the last few years, I also did some games that have definitely the big retro style, which is super fun because it kind of brings me back to that time, which I find in gaming the most interesting for me. So there's Tiny Tor and And then finally, Interstellar Sentinel was the last project I worked on. And again, like retro style bullet hell shooter. And this music is also very much like Turrican, Katakis, those kind of things. Finally, last thing is my Patreon project, which I'm working on diligently every month, creating a new piece for my Patreon fans. And the pieces that I do there are all royalty free, so they can be used if you have a YouTube channel or something and you want some background music and stuff. And I have over 85 pieces there, and every month another one. So join me there. They also have now free signups, so I use this instead of the other social media stuff more frequently now. So that's my little presentation here.
Fantastic. Thank you for the introduction then, Chris. Thank you. I did mention we'll give you guys a chance to ask Chris some questions as well, but I'd like to just dive a bit deeper into some of that as well. I mean, obviously you mentioned winning the magazine competition, which, you know, you entered the industry shortly after as well. I mean, let's talk about Rainbow Arts and how you got involved with them, and obviously working on titles like Great Giana Sisters and Turrican as well. How did that relationship start then, and what was that like?
After I won that contest and did the sound monitor, I just started to cold call companies to see if they need music and, you know, get some side income while I was still going to school. And Rainbow Arts was one of them, and they immediately booked me for one of their games, and they actually asked me right away if I want to come work for them. So I finished, I didn't finish school completely. I left actually mid-12th grade and joined the team at Rainbow Arts at only 18 years old. And yeah, so the rest there is history, as you mentioned, Giana Sisters and other things, yeah.
What about Factor 5 and Turrican as well?
That came a little bit later. So Factor 5 was an external team that had another R-Type clone type of game, and they wanted to find a publisher for that. And then we had Katakis, which was our R-Type clone in that sense. And they decided, okay, we can make that the Katakis on the Amiga. And then we had the C64 version, and that's how Factor 5 became introduced to the whole team. And eventually they superseded Rainbow Arts as a company and became their own thing. And I joined them doing all the other amazing projects.
Let's know a bit more about, because obviously Turrican is legendary soundtrack. And you mentioned, you kind of touched upon it there, those advanced audio techniques that you were using on the Amiga, for example, because the Amiga was only a 4-channel audio system usually, but you expanded that to 7 for games like Turrican 2. How did that work then? What was the process there?
Yeah, I mentioned it briefly, but I had actually a friend and colleague in the industry, Jochen Hippel. He was an Atari ST guy and a very good programmer, and he made a emulation of the what the Amiga chip was doing on the CPU in the Atari ST. And since they have the same CPU, Amiga and Atari ST, I thought like, hey, that technology could be ported back to the Amiga and then put that into one channel and then have the other 3 Amiga channels regular. And the advantages there was already something that was playing 8 voices. I think, was it Octalyzer? Or something. Yeah. But the thing is, they degraded every voice because everything was, they mixed 2 into each voice. So all the channels were kind of degraded in sound quality. And with the 7 voice system, I could decide like certain samples would play nicely on there, like bass and some drums and stuff. But if I needed to play some sounds with a higher frequency content, I played them on the 3 remaining Amiga channels. So that was just overall a better and more efficient system, even though it was 7 voices instead of 8.
Experimenting with what sounded best on each channel.
And every kind of artist had their own style and way of doing it. Were there other composers that you admired at the time in the video game
on the
scene?
Commodore 64, certainly Rob Hubbard and Martin Galway and a bunch of other ones. On the Amiga, Alistair Brimble is also like a good colleague and friend of mine, and a bunch of other ones.
So coming from the Commodore 64, which, like you said, was basically a synthesizer of the SID chip, legendary, and then the Amiga, a sample-based system. What was your impression of the Amiga, and how did you find that transition from working on the SID chip to Paula on the Amiga?
Yeah, I totally like the idea of the sampling. I mean, the SID chip will always have like a special place in my heart, but sampling just gives you so much more options what you can do in terms of sound. And also, I mean, sampling was the thing that became big in pop music in the mid 80s. And you were hearing about like these super expensive systems like Fairlight, Sampler and stuff that cost $100,000 or more. And so the fact that like 2 years later you could buy a computer for like a few $1,000 and that had 4-channel sample playback was just amazing to me.
And you mentioned R-Type earlier for the C64 and Amiga. That version that you did was absolutely amazing, and keeping that kind of pace and the rhythm and speed. How did you approach that? And did you have the original arcade as well?
So the in-game music is all original arcade. In the arcade machine, there's not really like a title music like we had on the Commodore 64 and Amiga games usually. So we decided there needs to be a new composition there. I first did the one on the C64. And I could have ported that directly to the Amiga, but then when I finally got my TFMX system good running on the Amiga, I decided, hey, let's make something that's actually really tailored to the samples and make a different tune. Yeah, that was more cinematic. And then funny enough, I don't know, almost 15, 20 years later, I did actually another one for the mobile version for R-Type. They did like a French company did an iOS version and then later Android, and they hired me to do like a 45-second music intro, and it again sounds different, but it is interesting that I did an R-Type title music on all these different platforms. Yeah.
I appreciate they're obviously very different as well, but I mean, do you have a preference with working on the C64 or the Amiga, or is it hard to choose?
Probably the Amiga because of the sampling, but as I said, the SID chip is always in my heart.
How is it kind of seeing these symphony performances of your music?
Absolutely mind-boggling. I mean, that Symphonic Shades concert, it was actually sold out, so they added a second performance on the same day. So the orchestra ran through it twice in the evening, and I was there sitting the whole time with like tears running down my cheeks.
You did Sinfonia Dramatica as well with
with Yoko Shimomura.
How was that with the two different sounds of, you know, the Japanese sound and the European sound together in one concert? That
was very interesting. And any concert is like an experience when they play your music with so many accomplished musicians. But it was special.
Must have been, we were talking about this yesterday, you know, you mentioned then about your grandma and, you know, learning the piano when you were young. And if she would have seen these...
She would have been amazed,
Because I mean, what did your family think of when you were doing like Commodore 64 music? Did they see that as like a legit music art form at first?
In the beginning, they did not understand it at all.
Right.
And then all of a sudden I had this like early successes with it. And then they were very proud. They were a little bit worried, me breaking off school and not finishing the final years. And but ultimately it worked out.
And how important has stuff like C64 audio, you know, fan sites, but also people that have got involved, like Chris Abbott? I know he helped with the Back in Time album.
It's really amazing that, I would have never thought that like 30 years on, there would still be an audience for that. But the nostalgia is a powerful thing. And so I'm also like thankful for people like Chris Abbott that keep it alive.
And I know he helps
I'm
organize
doing my part, of course.
He helps organize concerts as well, events, which it must be exciting when you hear about a new one as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
And we mentioned about sampling before as well, and how, obviously that started to take off in the 80s. And I remember there was legal problems when people were sampling records without permission. Have you ever encountered that? Has anyone ever sampled your work, and have you heard it in strange places?
It has happened. And I mean, I had my own kind of plagiarism, which we didn't think of like that in the late 80s when we worked on the Commodore 64, and I did a few pieces just like that for demos, and some even ended up in some games, and we didn't even think about it. But then the whole sampling thing was another layer, and actually a few years ago some DJs stole some of my compositions and put it out as like club mixes, and they did never ask for permission, so that's a little bit annoying. But I talked to some lawyers about it, but when it's not at least like a top 10 hit, it's not worthwhile pursuing because you're never getting anything.
And I know you also do royalty-free music as well. Yeah. So kind of on the other side, you've got creators that can use that in their videos. And
I started that Patreon thing as like a hobby on the side, and it's been really nicely growing. And I think it's kind of cool that people can use that and just mention me with name, and then it's fine.
I'm interested as well about, after kind of the Amiga faded away and then platforms like the PlayStation came along and CD-ROM audio. I mean, obviously the scene changed completely then when we could stream audio from a CD. How did that impact your career then in that stage?
Yeah, that was really like the freedom, and I had already built a nice studio by then. And so Tunnel B1 was my first big one, where I used a lot of orchestral sounds and made something that sounded really cinematic. And that was on the CD as Red Book audio tracks.
And you recently released the Interstellar Sentinel soundtrack as well.
So this brings it all like full circle. So now I'm making music that sounds kind of like the old music with some, I even use some synth sounds in there and other things to make it even sound more like the old stuff. And it's just fun. It's super fun.
A lot of people are going for that now. I've seen there's lots of new plugins that are coming out to, recreate the SID. And if you found there's a bit of a modern audience of producers as well that are contacting you, and
yeah, totally. And it's a unique sound that is you cannot really replicate that with a high-end synthesizer. It's its own thing, and it's immediately recognizable when you hear a SID lead or one of those arpeggios or things like that.
Well, in 2021 as well, you did the Turrican anthology. So what was it like revisiting those classic works, and tell us a story of kind of bringing them back to life and reworking them for the 21st century?
Yeah, so I had done actually a first soundtrack for Turrican in 1993. That was my fourth CD that I put out. And it was only one CD, and it had a selection of pieces, but not everything. And I thought over the years, should I do a volume 2 and stuff like that, but never sounded right. And also CD sales were kind of like tapering off, and so I didn't know if that would justify the effort to put in. And then all of a sudden I saw this Kickstarter thing take off, and I thought, hey, if I get enough fans to essentially pre-order the CD and help me make this happen, then it could work. And it did work actually really nicely, and became like a 4 CD version of literally all the Turrican pieces.
Did you have to kind of strip them right back to basics and rebuild them? How did that kind of work?
Well, I had the original Amiga pieces in the back of my music program, and then I built the tracks with modern sounds and synthesizers, and then I usually enhanced the track, made it longer, and did some new parts in there and stuff like that. Yeah, to make the experience even more interesting for the fans.
But you also had a vinyl release as well.
That was a little bit later than the vinyl edition, and in fact, then also the orchestral recordings we also did on vinyl. And then for the second orchestra Kickstarter, I did promise to make a new Turrican sound, a virtual Turrican soundtrack, not for like something that could have been if it was made in the mid 90s on the Amiga, a new Turrican soundtrack. So I used then my old tools to make this bonus disc, and it was horrendous because I was so long out of it, and my tools back then, they were not very comfortable really. But when you're like a 20-year-old, it's just like it's flowing out of you, and you don't have any worries about usability and stuff. But I worked myself back in there, and it was tough, but I did it and made a full new soundtrack CD of original Amiga sounds as a virtual Turrican 4.
Yeah. I mean, you touch on the vinyl release there as well. I mean, for a musician, having your music on that form, what does that feel like when you actually hold a vinyl of your music?
That's actually very nice. I mean, holding a vinyl is cool, and then you have usually the gatefolds, and there's like more space for artwork and pictures and stuff. And then when it's a collection with like a box set, and we had these made for the Kickstarter where it was the double vinyl, some art prints and the CD in there too, and it just feels very valuable when you hold it in your hand.
It's kind of a new thing as well, video game vinyl. Before there were a few odd releases, but now it's a whole scene of collectors.
It's amazing that vinyl really came back, because people like to collect them now and find them cool.
I remember people selling off their old collections, and now they're all buying them back. Yeah,
even cassette tapes are making a comeback.
I've seen a few in shops.
Yeah. The advantage with those is you can make very small runs. You can make like 50 tape copies, and it's relatively easy to duplicate.
I know you mentioned about working on retro titles in the modern day. You've been in some Mega Drive music as well recently, haven't you?
Oh my goodness, yeah, I couldn't believe it, but I recently was approached by a client they wanted to do like a special version of their game. It's actually the farm simulator. So you would think like, really? But I guess they did like a cool C64 version at some point, and then now they're doing it on the Sega Mega Drive Genesis system. And they need music, and I worked myself back into Tracker.
I think they did a multiple release, so they had like a collector's edition with a C64 version, and then the modern versions as well.
I'm actually just putting the final touches on that right now, and it's gonna come out on cartridge, and they're making a special edition with a CD version too.
Are you seeing more kind of titles for older systems started to come out recently, and more interest in that?
Retro is hip.
Yeah.
So.
What hardware do you produce it on? Have you still got like a Commodore 64 setup you're using, an Amiga? And
I still have all my original hardware, but I cannot use it in the US. I tried and I burned one up. It's just because of I had like a transformer, but the power supply didn't like it. And then the 50 hertz was derived from the power as well in Europe. And it just doesn't work. So, and I'm not working on an NTSC machine. I don't like the faster pace there. I like what I grew up with. And so I use emulators now.
Right, fair enough.
But I still have my original C64 and Amiga. They're actually on permanent loan to a exhibition that travels around Germany and Europe. By Rainer Meyer, and he's at Gamescom usually, and he displays them in display cases and stuff. And
that's great. Have you had any interest from museums or any places?
Yeah. I'm in talk with some museums that want to do like certain displays of early computer music and stuff like that. And so there's more coming in that, because now people realize that history now.
Yeah.
It's all strange seeing your childhood in a museum.
I know,
isn't it?
right? Yeah.
I mean, obviously, you work with a lot of indie studios these days. I mean, how do you find that compared to working with the big companies? Is which one do you prefer? Like,
I really like working with indies because it's more like the old days where it was small teams and you had like a more personal connection and it's more collaborative that way. So definitely on the Tiny Thor and the Interstellar Sentinel, those were projects that were super fun to do.
Are you doing any projects you can tell us about or any future collaborations coming up?
As I said, I'm wrapping up on those things, but I usually have NDAs for upcoming projects, but there's a few things in the works.
Fantastic. Well, I'm sure you've got questions you'd like to ask Chris. So we do have a microphone. Just raise your hand if you have any questions.
On the Rogue Squadron, the music was dynamic and changed as you play. How was it composing for that in contrast with just linear soundtracks?
A little bit tricky, but the most tricky part was defining the areas and when to switch over and setting all the values for that to work and not sound too jarring or weird. So we developed a pretty cool system where when you would fly along we had like an inner area and outer area where things were triggered. So that you would fly, if you would fly back and forth, it wouldn't like constantly switch. So things like that. And then obviously like the authoring was a little bit tricky there. And then with that project, it was intimidating from day one because I'm such a big John Williams fan. And I always thought like I wasn't worthy to do something because I'm not a classically trained musician. But I really tried my best, and also after it was finished, I could not listen to it for like a year because I thought like when it was wrapped up, I was depleted and I didn't think I was doing such a good job. And then I listened to it about a year later, and I thought like, you didn't do such a bad job after all. So but that was definitely nerve-wracking working with that material.
Yeah, sometimes when you're there in the moment, you have to take your head out the space to really see what it could do.
And in fact, one thing was they invited me up to the ranch, to the Lucas Ranch, and had somebody there review my stuff.
Wow! So
that it would that they would approve my compositions for Star Wars.
You got to visit the ranch then?
Yeah.
What was that like?
I was up there like 3 times, but that time when they reviewed it, I was really nervous and not very enjoying it. But the other time I was one time invited there for lunch, and the other time, so I just got a tour, and the other time I was invited to a symphony recording there. So they have a recording studio, and that was really amazing to see them work. That was for some Disney movie or something they recorded, and that was quite something.
Hello.
Hi.
I was just wondering, what kind of music do you listen to every day when not working on video game music? And do you find yourself inspired by any of your favorite artists or genres that you listen to?
I'm probably not listening to as much music as I should as a musician myself. But when I was younger, of course, I consumed a lot, and I started with the Beatles, and then I worked my way up through pop music, mostly like synthesizer driven, so the whole like new wave and everything that came out of Britain was very influential. Big fan of the Pet Shop Boys and other things. But I always have to say, like, I'm also a fan of Italo disco, which is a little bit, that's a little bit embarrassing, but so all those things. And then, of course, like the big synthesizer artists like Jean-Michel Jarre and Kraftwerk and Tangerine Dream and those things. And then film music. I listened to a lot of film music in the 90s because I was kind of aspiring to do film music. Still waiting for that director fan of mine that would hire me for their movie. But But nowadays, I just usually, when I get a project that needs a certain style, then I go on Spotify and I create a playlist of music that could kind of fit in that genre, and then I listen to that a lot. And then whatever I can find, like if I'm in the mood for some new Italo disco, you find it on Spotify.
Yeah. Doing like retro wave and stuff recently.
Yeah. Oh yeah, now of course, like you mentioned the synthwave thing, and there's a lot of cool artists there.
Yeah, absolutely.
I just have a random question as well. I was just wondering, did you enjoy it when you had the limitation of audio and space compared to now, where you've probably got the whole?
It can be interesting because it forces you to concentrate on the really important stuff if you have little voices or memory or something. But it can also be stifling sometimes. So it's like sometimes it's fun and sometimes it's not.
Yeah. Imagine on the 64 sometimes you might have had ideas for stuff you wanted in music you had to take out, and even like disk space, I imagine, was a consideration. Did you get that with publishers saying you've only got a certain amount of kilobytes on a disk for the music?
On the Turrican projects, particularly with samples, it was like always a fight because those are like very high-end, graphic intensive, and so there was not a lot of space. And I usually would compose the pieces, and then I would go in and try to cut the samples down to the absolute minimum so that it would still sound okay, but not take more space than it needed.
Right.
And some of the tracks in Turrican use like the whole world of like one game section would use like 60 or 70 kilobytes with samples, the music data, the replay, the program and everything. So it's insane that actually worked out.
And you think about that now, like an icon on your desktop's probably more.
Oh yeah. I even like a few years ago, I came across with a friend. He was like cleaning up his basement, and he found an old hard drive, for the Amiga.
Yeah.
And it was this big, and it had 20 megabytes.
Yeah, megabytes, not gigabytes.
No,
yeah,
megabytes. And we thought like, oh, what could you do with this? Oh, you could save 3 MP3 files on there.
That probably cost the same price as the computer as well back then.
Oh yeah, those were expensive back then, and they were loud.
Yeah.
If you would start them up, it was almost like a washing machine would be running.
Vibrate your table.
Yeah.
Any more questions for Chris?
When you were making music on trackers, how did you get your samples and how do you load them on the system?
At the time when I did the Amiga music, I already had 2 synthesizers. One was the Ensoniq ESQ1, which, by the way, interesting enough, I picked that out in a music store because I liked it from the sound and the features and stuff. And then later I found out that synthesizer was designed by the guy who invented the SID chip.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
It's a coincidence.
Yeah, isn't it?
Yeah, crazy.
Anyway, so, and the other one was the Korg M1, and most of the samples came from those machines. And then a couple of other things that I sampled on the C64 beforehand, they were just like ripped from pop music. So like the old sampling as they were from that got some people into trouble when the whole sampling thing started.
Did you like hear a certain like drum beat and think I'll sample that?
Yeah, but I didn't sample the whole drum beat because that wouldn't fit anyway. But single drums.
What was your tracker of choice as well?
I developed my own at the beginning, and I never worked on any sound tracker or pro tracker or whatever up until like a few weeks ago when I started on that Sega Mega Drive project because I could not get my old tools I did actually Sega soundtracks for Mega Turrican and Jim Power, but that system I cannot get to work again because the hardware doesn't exist anymore. So now I use Furnace, which is a new tracker.
Another question I think up there.
What is your favorite synthesizer that you have owned or own?
Oh, my favorite synthesizer. Well, it's got to be the ESQ1 Ensoniq. I just love that thing. Yeah.
What makes that so special?
I don't know. Maybe it's the architecture. It's more modern sounding than a SID, but it has the same kind of general layout. And I was just very comfortable programming that, and I got some really cool sounds. Like 80% of the Turrican synth sounds are from that machine. And right now, it's just like 2 years ago, I bought another synth from Arturia called the Mini Freak, which is really cool. I like that one.
Factor 5 worked with LucasArts and Star Wars, but you had a connection to LucasArts before then with The Secret of Monkey Island, which you did the Amiga conversion for. How did that come about?
So the publishing in Germany was done by Soft Gold Rushware for these American games that came in, and one of them was Monkey Island, and they needed a port and some other things to the Amiga. And I don't know who exactly did the programming on the port, but they needed somebody to, transcribe the music from the PC, which was done on a pretty high-end sound card. This is an MT32 sound card or something, to the Amiga, and that's when they said like, hey, Chris needs to do this.
The Great Giana Sisters.
Yeah.
You made the music and you're famous for it. But what was your thought when Giana Sisters went from the sales because of Nintendo?
Yeah, I like to tell that story. My boss was he wasn't that much really into gaming, but he wanted to get good ratings for our games, and the games at the time at Rainbow Arts, they were all like not that great. And we did a press tour where we went to all the magazines in Germany, and they were all playing Super Mario Brothers, and they were gaga about it. They said like, oh, this is the best game of all time. And then my boss looked at it in their offices and he said like, we can do something like that in a few weeks. And the magazine people said, oh, if you do a game like this, it would get like a 90 rating or higher, and so I could see his like dollar signs flashing in his eyes. And so we drove back, and he made immediately like a meeting with everybody and said like, hey, we're gonna do a game like that. And his brainstorming there in the session was like, oh, instead of brothers, we'll make it sisters, and we need like another Italian name. And he was a fan of Gianna Nannini, the rock singer. So we'll call it the Giana Sisters. And the Giana was written with 2 N at the time. And in the C64 and the scroller, you still see that was the 2 N. But then like 3 days before it was supposed to be duplicated and shipped out, the cover artist came back with the airbrush cover, and he had written it was 1 N. So it was no time to change it anymore. So we went back in and changed it where we could, but in that scroller it's still in. So it became Giana Sisters instead of Gianna. So, yeah. And then it was all fine. In Germany, it sold for like a good 3 months, and it sold really well. Then it was offered to other distributors in other countries, and among them in Britain. And they made the mistake of like poking the bear, and they, in a marketing campaign, they wrote something like "Move over, brothers! Here come the Giana Sisters," and the brothers are history and stuff. And Nintendo didn't like that at all. So then they became aware of it, and they threatened a lawsuit. And we took it off the market, and they didn't sue us, but it was then, yeah. And then we had already worked on Giana 2. And because of that threatening of the lawsuit, we changed all the graphics and made the figurines into little robots, and became hard and heavy. That was essentially like Giana 2, but it's now has different graphics and slightly different gameplay. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question. If anyone has one, just raise your hand.
What is your thought about AI?
Oh, yeah. It's kind of scary for sure. But I have actually played around a little bit with it, and now I'm not so scared anymore. because what it mostly does is really imitate well pop music, which it has like a huge pool of music to draw from, and now the big labels are suing them, probably out of business. I think it can be a tool. It can definitely get you some new ideas and stuff. And the thing is, like, any smart company out there will probably not really use it because they can be in danger of being sued, because they cannot be sure what was it trained on, how similar is it really to something else. And in the music business, it's all about, if you have a hit and you make a lot of money and something sounds similar, you're in danger of being sued. And it's just then up to like in theory a jury, and if they hear like this sounds almost exactly like this, then you're screwed. So I think it will be a tool. Yeah, I'm not too worried anymore about it.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Chris.
Thank you.
Thank you.